Okay, let's look back and think about everything that we've done so far. Okay, we came up with a question about what we wondered about. We researched the topic to learn more about it and to see what other experiments others had tested with the same idea. We wrote the steps to our science experiment, okay? Then we went back to make sure we have a testable question, and we took a look at that testable question and we wrote a hypothesis. Now we're ready to identify what the independent variable is for our experiment. So, what is an independent variable? Well, when we look at the experiment, what are we going to change? Well, what's being tested in the experiment? The variable that is changed throughout the experiment, okay? So this is the definition of an independent variable. The variable that is changed throughout the experiment. Okay, well, look at this example. Paper airplane. Example number 1. Does changing the size of a paper airplane affect how it flies? So what is the variable that is going to change if it matches this example? Does changing the size of a paper airplane affect how far it flies? Well, let's see. It's going to be the size of the paper airplane, just like in your experiment. Here's another one. What material best conducts heat? Well, what variable is going to change? All right, so what would we change? We would change the materials that's tested, okay? So we'd have to have a variety of different materials to test. Does the length of a wire affect the strength of an electromagnet? Well, what is going to change in there? It would have to be the length of the wire, because it says right here, does the length of a wire. The variable that is changing is we're going to have different lengths of wire. Just like up here, we have different sizes of the paper in which we folded the paper airplane to. So this is an example of an independent variable. Go ahead and take a screenshot of this so that you have it, because this is going to be very important when you're writing your science, your steps, and when you're explaining your experiment. All right, now the next one. I can identify the dependent variable. Okay, so we just figured out what the independent variable is. So now we're ready to identify the dependent variable in an experiment. And we're going to use those same 3 examples we did on the previous slide. So what is a dependent variable? And then we're going to figure out what the dependent variable is for the paper airplane, conducting heat, and the strength of an electromagnet, like the wire, the length of the wire. How does it affect the strength? All right, so let's figure out what is a dependent variable. If independent is changing, then dependent, okay, is the variable that changes based on the independent variable. Okay, well, that's confusing. Let's see what it means for the paper airplane. So we know that the size of the paper was the independent variable. The dependent variable is going to be how far did each one fly, depending on the size of the paper. So what do you think what material best conducts heat? Remember, the independent variable was the materials tested. So what do you think is going to be the dependent variable? if you said how much heat is conducted based on the material, you were correct. All right. Does the length of a wire affect the strength of an electromagnet? Well, we're testing length of wire. So what is our dependent variable? It's going to be how strong the electromagnetic is. All right. So this is depending on the length. Okay, so now we've identified the independent and the dependent variable. They go together. Take a screenshot of this page so that you have it on your iPad, because again, this is going to come in handy when you are writing out your science experiment. Okay, so we figured out independent, dependent. Now we're ready to identify the controlled variable in experiment. And we're going to use the same 3 examples as we did for the independent and the dependent variable. So what are the controlled variables? Okay, so what are we controlling here? All right, so we're going to look at the same 3. So let's figure out what is controlled. Okay, well, if somebody controls you, they are limiting what you can do. You can have apples or bananas, okay? It's a controlled environment. Instead of going, what kind of fruit do you want? And you're like, oh, I don't know, grapes, maybe apples, oranges, who knows? Okay, so controlled means a limit, okay? What are you limiting? So when we look at a controlled variable, the variables that we keep the same, okay? So let's figure out and see how that is different from independent and the dependent variable. All right, so what would the controlled variables be here for the paper airplanes? Well, it's the material of paper. Remember I told you to take out your notebook paper, okay? The design of the plane. Remember how I told you you're going to just change the size of the paper, but you're going to fold every single airplane the same way? That's a controlled variable. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, the force when throwing it. So you don't want to take like the little airplane and go bloop, and it like, okay, there it goes. Oh, it must be the size of the paper. You know, the smaller the airplane, the less it flies further. And then when you get the big piece, you're like, oh, with all of your might, you're throwing it. Okay, that's the force. So you need to control it, meaning you need to throw all of those airplanes the exact same way every time for your experiment to be valid. That means a good experiment, okay? If you throw one and then your mom throws one and then your dad throws one and you're like, yup, it's the size, well, that wouldn't count. Every single person would have to fly every single plane the same way, the same amount of times, okay? That's the controlled part. Everything is the same. Okay, what material best conducts heat? Well, what would we control? We would control the temperature, okay? We would make sure that every single time we're testing this material and does it conduct heat, is the temperature in the room the same so that it doesn't affect how something heats or cools? Okay, the length of the wire. What's going to be controlled for this? Well, the battery. All right, we need to make sure that we're using the same battery for every length of wire. And every length of wire, they all have to come from the same spool. So you're not testing all the different types of wires. You're testing one type of wire and one battery. All of that has to stay the same. This is a controlled variable examples. Go ahead and take a screenshot. And then what you're going to do is you're going to go back into your science experiment. You're going to go back to what you felt was the independent, dependent, and the controlled variables. You're going to write down what your independent variable is, your dependent variable, and what your controlled variables are for your science experiment, and you're going to upload them in the very next activity.